the idea. Now, how do we make sense of the fact that if everything is mental, if the entire universe, the whole of existence is mental?
What I'm looking for a word. Notice he says, the fact that if, let's hear it again.
Everything is mental, if the entire sense of the fact, that's the idea. Now, how do we make sense of the fact that if everything is mental?
The fact that if everything is mental, right? You can have a fact that is based on an if, right? And if is not a fact. That's simply invalid reasoning. The fact that if, right? You have to, that's why I call these things I'm doing here a deconstruction. Because I'm not necessarily invalidating all the philosophy in there, or the conclusion and so on. I'm trying to point out how well this philosophy is being done, right? Now, the fact that if, that doesn't work, right? So he's trying to force you into understanding his if as if it's a fact, right? He came up with an idea, and if it's a fact, right? Which decided, okay, now I'm going to treat it as a fact. So he's sort of bending things into he's just forming it, he's channeling it into where he wants to go, right? This is a surefire sign of a sophist, right? It's not someone who's saying, no, I can't just make a fact out of an if, right? That's invalid. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, how much more proof do you need that this guy doesn't really do good philosophy, right?
If the entire universe, the whole of existence is mental, why do I not have access to everything? Why don't I know what your thoughts are? Why don't I know what is going?
But what does it entail to know? Having access to a thing or having an experience or whatever, does that necessarily entails knowledge? Because then you're basically calling everything knowledge. Then mind and knowledge is the same, or what? It's just, I would like some more clarity in how you describe things. You can't just throw around terms this way if you haven't settled it. If you're doing metaphysics, you're settling on the foundations way before you have any idea or definition of knowledge, right? So it's again this lack of sensitivity to what he's doing. It's someone who had a deep, profound, quote, bullshit bingo inside, right? And thinking all of a sudden he's sort of seen the light, and he's just going to throw around words because now he has seen the light. He's the Jesus of philosophy, right? Sort of, no, you need to go back to the drawing board and do better than this, right?
Going on in China or the galaxy of Andromeda, because I am a mental being as well. If the world is mental and I am...
So when you're saying Andromeda, what are you then referring to if you can't see it? What are you referring to? You can't see, you're referencing something as an existence of some kind, or what, right? But then you're saying, I can't experience it. Well, then what are you referring to then? You must refer to something you can experience. Otherwise, where the hell does it come from, that Andromeda thing, right? So there is something you can experience. It's just, it's as Juran, I forget your name in the comments, right? Wrote that, yeah, but this is not the full course. This is just the idealism light for the little people, right? For the peasants, they're too stupid to understand the big thing in his 10 books or whatever, right? I don't buy that. because there has to be some foundational leaps or steps or foundational philosophy that is so simple and clear cut that it doesn't take a book to explain it, right? I don't buy this idea that philosophy should be so fucking complicated and cumbersome that you have to write 10 books just to explain how you get from experience to mind, right? I don't buy that, because then rather than sitting here trying to convince me that you have come up with some brilliant philosophy, you should be pounding on the doors of basically every self-proclaimed authority in the world who runs around bossing people around, telling them what to do, and say, no, stop. We haven't figured it out yet. We are philosophers. Listen to us, right? No. He would rather sit there and make some kind of, idealism light and hoping I'm falling for the trap, right? Go out and bang some doors from philosophy, on politicians and prime ministers and whatever kind of crap personality, and tell them they don't know the fuck what they're doing, right? Do that instead of trying to convince me of this weirdo philosophy.
Mental, why can't I have a much more direct, intimate communication with all there is, instead of being cooped up in my own individual mind? How can that be? And what is the relationship between our bodies, our brains, and our minds? Because they are very, very intimately correlated. We know that empirically.
We know. This we know. There's no we know. There's no we that knows. There's no collective knowledge, right? They're only individual knowledge. That's my philosophy. Otherwise, you need to fucking state very clearly how you get to this kind of collective knowledge, right? There's no we knowledge. There's my knowledge, there's your knowledge, and then the guy or girl's knowledge over there, and so on, right? There is no we knowledge. There's no we knowledge floating around that everybody knows by default or something like that, right? Which is inherently what he's appealing to. I need to listen to this bit again, sorry.
Bodies, our brains, and our minds, because they are very, very intimately correlated. We know that empirically.
We know that empirically. Mind and brain are correlated empirically. But brain is a representation on your dashboard. And mind is an abstraction you have come up with. You don't experience mind, right? What color does mind have? What sound does mind have? What taste does mind have? You say you can't experience mind. Just because you experiencing your own so-called mind is actually not an experience of mind. That's the qualia you are experiencing within that which you call mind, right? You're not experiencing mind. Mind is a category you have come up with, an umbrella term to catch all that goes on within that area that you call mind. That's just labeled mind. That doesn't mean that mind and brain is connected, because brain is a representation of the dashboard. You're saying the dashboard is made of mind. And then you say, okay, and one of the dials over there is brain. Then you say there's a connection between mind and brain. Well, obviously, because you call the dashboard brain, or you call it mind. All the dials you call mind. Yeah, but it's of a artificial linguistic nature, not an empirical nature. And certainly not some kind of collective empirical nature. He doesn't know the fuck what he's doing, right? I encourage you to very thoroughly scrutinize what he's saying here, right? And that he's not just tapping into some preconceived understanding of where this should lead or where you want it to lead. And therefore you follow along because you know it goes in the direction you want to, right? Don't have a philosophy where you just, confirm your agendas or arrive at confirmation bias, right? Don't delude yourself. Don't delude you. What's it called? Delude yourself. Don't do that, right? Be honest. Be neutral. Start from the ground, where there's no preconception of any kind, and say, what do I have to work with? What's the starting point? My starting point is the 5 qualia, right? That's my metaphysics. You might come up with something different. I'm fine with that. Just explain it to me, make a presentation. Maybe I could get inspired, right? But scrutinize it, right? This is lousy philosophy, in my opinion, right? He's just throwing around, and this is potentially groundbreaking news, right? I'm saying potentially. If he could actually argue well for it, it might be. I'm not saying it's not good philosophical conclusions, but he doesn't present how he gets to it. He just pretends that it's given to you, right? It's sort of, yeah, everybody knows this, right?
Now, there is a phenomenon, a well-known condition in psychiatry called dissociation. That's something we have known of for a couple of centuries, but since the turn of the 20th...
We have known of. So he's sort of lumping you into it, right? It's like, everybody they accept this. So if you implicitly sort of appealing to, if you don't accept, there's something wrong with you. Are you not going with the consensus, right? There's nothing that everybody knows, right? How did you get to this dissociation? If it's about mind or mental or consciousness or whatever term you're using, how did you get to it? You can't crawl in somebody else's mind and take a part in that experience, right? You have to sort of look from the outside. And what you do is looking or listening or tasting. So you're basically saying, I have some experiences here. I have interpreted this way. And I've come up with an explanation. Well, then it's an explanation. It's not the actual thing, right? So it's like he wants to appeal to this decoding of his qualia as a one-to-one presentation of what is going on beyond his mind, right? Now, that's the step I'm going to say I'm not going there, right? Because it's bullshit. Because he's always, and they're saying it directly, he's appealing to empiricism, right? Empirical knowledge, right? He has said that several times now. When it's empirical, it's about your qualia. And when it's a qualia, it's your experience. Then it's not whatever you interpret that experience to be on the outside, right? You can't make it a interpretation on the inside of the experiences and say that interpretation is actually the actual thing going on out there, because it's based on your experiential experiences, right? Your qualia. You can't have something that has somehow condensed into qualia and then decode it back to, right? It's sort of when a computer program has been compiled into bits and ones and zeros and whatever, you can't decode it or decompile it back into the program, right? You can't do that. It's sort of the same kind of thing here. When it has become qualia, whatever that qualia was based on is no more. Because now it's qualia. Now it's not the thing itself. So no matter what the fuck you do with these qualia, you can never get to what it actually was. It originated from. If it originated from anything, which is the first step in your, or should be your first leap in your philosophy, if you're talking about this inside-outside dichotomy, right? You can't decompile a program into its programming language. And if you have something and you're only seen whatever program, you don't even know it if it has been compiled or not. In analogy with the qualia, you just have those qualia. And it's your own desire and want and need for there to be an outside, and a need and a passion and so on to explain it, so you don't have this area where you have to say, I can't go there and explain anything, right? You don't have to explain it in order to go about your life. You don't have to go out there and try to explain it. First of all, you shouldn't, because you can't. And secondly, you don't need to go there in order to have a fully functional philosophy, in my opinion, right? Okay.
In the first century, we know a lot more about it thanks to the advent of neuroimaging. We know that people who suffer from an extreme form of dissociation called the dissociative identity disorder, or DID, we know that the patterns of...
We know that, okay, academia has come up with, and therefore we know, everybody knows because somebody have some knowledge over there and they're telling me about it, so therefore I also have that knowledge. So he's basing his philosophy on hearsay, right? I mean, no matter how fancy and well argued some so-called scientific article or report or whatever is, it's not your science. No matter how well it's described, a book, an article, some ink on some paper is not the science that ink and paper potentially wants to explain. Right? You have to have this experience yourself. That is actually the exercise of philosophy. You're trying to deal with your own experience. Right? So if you are coming up with some the science is not the result. The science is the method used to get to the result, or to the confirmation, or the opposite. What's it called? Defamation. The rejection, right, of any hypothesis that can be tested scientifically. Right? It's all conclusions that an individual make based on their empiricism. But just because somebody else claims to have empiricism doesn't mean that you have that empiricism. It should be obvious, right? So in philosophy, you cannot appeal to somebody else's experience because that's what you are trying to deal with in the first place. So you can't circumvent it. When you're trying to establish a metaphysics, you are trying to get a grasp of this experience of yours, right? Then you can't sort of reach through the experience and drag out some science and say, okay, now I'm going to use this science to explain that experience I used to get to that science that somebody else did, right? You see the circularity. I keep pointing this out because it's important. He's violating a basic thought structure, right?
Their brain activity differs from a group of control subjects. So DID can even be diagnosed objectively. We know that dissociation can be so strong that it can literally render you blind to what is right in front of your eyes. As a matter of fact, this is exactly the result of research done in Germany in 2015. A woman suffering from a severe form of DID had multiple subpersonalities, which in psychiatry are called alters.
So all the 8 billion people you're potentially, preaching to, right? They should rely their metaphysics on some woman claiming something in Germany. Some woman in Germany claiming something. Somebody listening and putting electrodes and, condensing that into some blemishes on a computer screen and then writing some stuff about it should be the basis of global metaphysics. It's like, you can't experience this, but there's some woman who you fall down the stairs and hit her head, and now she can have a split personality something, and therefore we should base our metaphysics on this. I don't buy it, right? For many reasons. Not least the one I pointed out before. He's trying to reach in front of his argument and pull it back to before his argument so he can make the argument he needs in order to go and grab that in front of his argument, right? That doesn't work.
Each alter of a person is a sort of a sub-personality with its own memories, its own personality traits, identifies differently from the other alters, go by different names. And in people, that's usually a reaction to trauma, when the mind of the person cannot bear the weight of the traumatic experience. It fragments itself into multiple disjoint centers of awareness. And this woman in Germany had multiple alters, some of which claimed to be blind, even though the woman herself was not blind. The host personality was not blind.
The host personality. So there was one of those personalities that you can trust, or what? How does that work? Do you fraction up in several personalities? It's just get it out of my face, right? Get it out of my face. Appeal to something that I have access to in my experience, right? Because that's what I need. I can't just listen to my experience and let my experience tell me how I should understand my experience, right? I have to do my own philosophy. When you're presenting your philosophy, I have to compare it to my philosophy. I can't go and listen to your philosophy unless I already have one of my own, or at least a very large extent of what I need to do in philosophy to create a philosophy before I can listen to somebody else's philosophy. I can't just fill in the blanks with somebody else's philosophy. That's stupid, right? So I have to fit it with my own philosophy, or compare it, right? And then say, okay, how does that fit? What is he talking about? I don't know. Yeah, okay, that might be a good idea, something like that, right? But then my philosophy must be based on what I can experience, right? Otherwise, what the hell am I doing then? Because my experience is that which I use, my eyes are open 16 hours a day or whatever, right? And I use my mouth when I eat, and my taste, and I smell, it smells bad when I go to the toilet, whatever, right? Depends on who you are, I guess. And so on. I look outside and I look at the door and where I need to grab my MacBook and whatever. I use it all the time. So if you don't agree with me that your experience and all of it, I mean the colors, the sounds, and the cognitions, and your categories and all whatever you want to call it that goes on there, right? If you're not taking that as the foundation of your philosophy, I'm not going your way, right? I'm saying, yeah, bye-bye, baby, right? Bye-bye, baby, what? Eddie, baby. Where did that come from? Bye-bye, baby? I don't know. So, if someone's claimed philosophy is not based on a attempt and classifying and interpreting their experience some way or another, right? Then I don't buy it. They can't go and say, I heard somebody talking about a woman in Germany who had a very traumatic experience. And she talks about she has several whatever, and we put some electrodes on her, and then we have some colors on the screen, and that means that, metaphysics, right? No. Fuck off.
Her eyes worked just fine. The optical nerve, the visual cortex, they were in fine order. So neuroscientists had this great idea to instrument this woman with an EEG cap to measure brain activity. And lo and behold, when a blind alter had executive control of the body, brain activity in the visual cortex at the back of the brain disappeared. even though the woman's eyes were open and she was perfectly sight capable. Now, this is not something one can fake. And when...
No, but it's like saying if I saw my car in half or something like that, it starts to act weird and say some funny noises and whatever. Well, yeah, obviously, possibly, right? But I would like to extend some scrutiny about the approaches. I'm not disregarding the experience or the experiment he's referring to as such, but the philosophy is that he can use science to justify a philosophy about how you get to do science. There is a structure there is something that follows, logic is a structure. It's a structure of deduction or whatever you want to call it, right? It's a structure. This is the case, that is the case, therefore it follows, right? You can't mix them together because there's a certain structure. And that structure of logic is a representation of something going on in your mind, right? So it seems reasonable to say maybe there's a structure to how your mind works, right? That's what I'm trying to get at in my recent presentation, the structure of my metaphysics, right? And that's logic is a representation of a structure in your mind, and therefore you can't. There are certain steps you have to go through to get to a particular point. For instance, science, and science is something, in my opinion, that you can only establish when you have established a lot of other stuff, particularly metaphysics and knowledge, right? So when he's talking about, obviously, metaphysics here, and he is using science, he's violating what he's doing. He's not saying it outright, right? You have to deconstruct it as I do here, or some other fashion, right? But it's invalid. It's an invalid thought structure. It's dysfunctional. He's bullshitting you, and he doesn't even understand it, right?
When a sighted author or the host personality was back in executive control, brain activity in the visual cortex came back to normal. So we know dissociation happens. We know that dissociation fragments one mind into multiple.
We know. I am really pissed about this we know thing, right? That also points to the fallacious understanding that because one person did science over there and told him about it, now everybody knows it, right? That's not good philosophy, in my opinion, right? Not at all. Because, and it's not even scientific, in my opinion. Yes, whatever that person did over there might have been scientific, but just because he tells you it's scientific doesn't make it scientific. You have to do the empiricism yourself for it to be scientific for you. That you want to go along with it and you say, I don't have the means or the technology and the time and the abilities and so on to do that kind of science. So I'm going to trust what they say. Well, that's on you. Fine. If you want to do that, I do that a lot also. But I can then claim it's your science and your knowledge, right? Just because I'm accepting it as knowledge for me because somebody else did that science. This is one of my biggest, possibly my biggest critique point of those going about doing science. They think they're tapping into some kind of library of knowledge. They're just, taking a slice off and telling people about, now we got this knowledge. No, we don't. That's not how it works. Not in my opinion, at least.
Multiple disjoint centers of awareness that often don't even know about each other's existence. And we know that it can literally make you blind to what is right in front of your eyes, let alone to somebody else's thoughts, let alone to what's happening in China or in the galaxy of Andromeda. So under analytic idealism, the mind of nature, a subjective field or a field of subjectivity that spans
The mind of nature. So nature is something else than mind? Or is he just saying, if mind and nature is the same, then it's the x of the x, right? Then it's tautological statement. And if it's not the same, then he's doing some kind of dualism, isn't he? I mean, otherwise I don't understand what he's actually saying. The mind of nature? Is mind made of nature or nature made of mind or what? I mean, and if it's made of something, then mind is not a reduction base as such, right? Then there's little subsets that he builds up to what he calls mind. There's some underlying stuff that he sort of takes for granted, but it's not clarified what he's actually really talking about, right?
and all of the universe undergoes something akin to dissociation. And we are the altars of nature. We are the altars of the universe. Every living being is an altar of the universe. And that's
Okay, right? I mean, every living being, what is that now, right? Is that the same as a dissociated altar or altar? It's it's just there are too many built-in axioms that are not clarified. There's too many assumptions, and if this is a fact, or sort of this kind of it's just something basically, as I say, he's pulled out of this ass. And then he say, if I treat this as a fact, therefore I can go. I remember a story I heard when I was very young. It was something like this lazy dude on a farm, and then the farm, the master of the farm or the head of the farm asks. Lays there in the hay and having relaxing, and then he comes over and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And then that guy says, "Silence, be still. I'm trying to catch the rats." When then the master said, "Well, how many rats have you caught?" "Well, if I get 2 more than the one I'm looking for now, I have 3. And then the master or the farm, the head of the farm says, "Wow, 3 rats, great, keep going," right? And he's just been laying there doing nothing, right? So it's less like you're building a fact upon a loose foundation of an if, something like that, right? And if you trust that, I can go about coming up with all sorts of shit about transpersonal this and the mind nature of that, and it's pure subjectivity, and he's just going mental. It's like when you lose the ties to your experiences, then he can go fucking crazy in whatever he wants, right? That's a good sign that he's out of bounds, right? You're out of bounds when you can just keep coming up with shit that I can't refute, right? I can't deal with it because you have disconnected yourself from the qualia, which is the foundation I need always to reference in order to make sure that I'm not coming up with shit that is unfounded.
That's why we can't read each other's thoughts. That's why we don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda. Because we are blinded by dissociation, just like that woman in Germany was blinded by dissociation.
So it's like, yeah, we can't see it, but I'm going to tell you about what's going on out there, right? In this sort of half-ass if effect, right? No, you're dissociated, you're blind to what is going on, but I'm telling you what is there. Pure subjectivity and ripples and whatever he can come up with, right? I mean, who would want to base their fucking life on this kind of... Yeah, I'm running out of terms to use, right? This fluffy, weirdo, mystic foundation. And as I said several times, it eventually just comes back to, I'm experiencing my MacBook. I'm experiencing my coffee. I'm experiencing my car. I'm experiencing my daughter. I'm experiencing, my bicycle. I mean, I still have to go to work. I still have to talk to my colleagues and have meetings. And, I have to go to the toilet and brush my teeth. And how does it really matter in any case if my philosophy is not dealing with that which I'm doing every day? All this fancy talk about a huge pure subjectivity that dissociates itself and whatever's going on, and then it's a tomato, right? Why would I care about this shit, man, right? If it never gets to anything I'm dealing with in my everyday, I don't give a flying fuck about it, right?
To what was right in front of her open eyes. Now, as I mentioned before, we can even diagnose dissociation under
right in front of her eyes. But if those who are making the experiments are blinded, how can they have an idea what is in front of her eyes? They only have an idea what is in front of their eyes. What if they're dissociated somehow? Then we can trust the shit, right? Give me a break, man. Oh, this is not thought through, right?
Functional brain scan. This was research done by Jolanda Schlumpf in the Netherlands in 2014.
Schlumpf?
There is something dissociative processes look like. They have an extrinsic appearance. They look like something identifiable. So my postulate.
This also have a very strong feeling for me or notion to me of cherry picking, right? Can I go out and find somebody who found something that fits the bill? Oh, dissociation over there. That's what I need to justify my weirdo philosophy here, right?
Is that what we call biology, what we call life, metabolism, is what dissociation in the mind of nature looks like. We don't need a brain scanner to see the dissociative processes in the mind of nature because we are in the mind of nature. We don't need to see through the skull. We are inserted. We are part of the mind of nature. So if you look around to identify an image on the dashboard that correlates with dissociation, in other words, that is what dissociation looks like when represented on our dashboard, that image is life. That's what life is. Life is what
so
a
life
dissociative
is
process
a color or a sound or a taste? Is that life? Life is a combination of colors, sounds, and taste, and so on? No, I don't think so, right? I don't think so. I can tell you what life is, right? Maybe I can tell you something about what life does, but I can't tell you what life is. Because it's a kind of abstraction, an interpretation. And interpretation is not that which it's trying to describe, because all my mental stuff is representations of an outside. So it's again, he is violating this idea of he has representation, the dials. And then he sort of now and then goes and say, well, that dial is out there. Right? It's ridiculous. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? It's just shrouded in this academic air and this he looks very serious and gentle. He's sort of a good little Christian boy there, right? He's a very nice and gentle, right? Unless if you deconstruct his shit, he's pulling the government guns on you like he did with me when I deconstructed his Analytic Idealism course on Essentia, right? Then it's sort of, if he can pull out the guns when nobody else is looking, right? He's not going to sit there and say, if you deconstruct my philosophy, I'm going to appeal to government that will ultimately kill you if you don't comply.
Field of subjectivity that underlies how nature looks like. And that is why your brain activity correlates with your inner experience. Because brain activity is what your inner experience looks like when observed from a cross, a dissociative boundary. Brain activity is the image of the phenomenon.
Observed from across, you can't go across. Now he's making this across thing as if there's something going across the dissociation. Across? It's sort of, now he says he's looking through that windscreen, doesn't he? He's appealing to a transparent windscreen now, which he just said in the beginning you don't have. Across a boundary? Now you can only look at the boundary and no further, right? So it's built in to the language. He's grooming you into accepting that he has been chosen to look through the windscreen for you. You can look yourself, but he's a magical being that can do this kind of thing, right?
The generator of the...
Maybe he's saying it in a way where he sort of says, if you look closely, you might be able to do so. And when you do, you can't really do it. And then you will say, okay, I have to go back to listen to Bernardo Kastrup. And then he becomes the priest he wants to be, right?
The phenomenon. And of course, the image correlates very well, most of the times, with the phenomenon it is an image of. And that's why...
How the hell do you know that? So now you're saying you have been outside the windscreen and check whether or not it correlates. There's something out there that correlates with your experiences. That's all I can hear, at least, right? I'm getting kind of pissed now, right? How can you sit there with a straight face and say that, right? This is completely corrupt, in my opinion. He's basically setting up a boundary. You can't do this. And in a couple of parts later in his presentation, he does exactly that. Or have a claim that would necessitate that being done, right? Give me a fucking break, man, right?
Brain activity and inner experience go hand in hand most of the times. Because what the phenomenon looks like correlates with the phenomenon. There's no surprise here. Now notice that in the case of an image, the image doesn't need to be complete. In other words, the image of the phenomenon does not need to tell you everything.
The image of the phenomenon? What are we dealing with? Do you mean my qualia? The colors and sounds I have? And what is a phenomenon? You can... The phenomenon is an interpretation of the qualia. You can't say the qualia arrived from the phenomenon. That's what the materialists do, you fucking freak, man, right? I'm getting so pissed now. You are appealing to exactly that's what you are trying to tell us is invalid. The phenomenon is not described by the qualia. The phenomenon is interpreted from the qualia within your mind. The qualia is not trying to tell you about a phenomenon. You are attaching phenomenon to the qualia. Otherwise, you're violating your dichotomy of the inside and outside. And then you're a materialist, right? Or something along those lines. So what is it then?
There is to tell about the phenomenon. But a cause does. If a phenomenon has a certain cause, then you should be able to construe and derive everything about the phenomenon from its cause. So if brain activity is the cause of experience, then there cannot be anything to experience that you can't trace back to brain activity. But if brain activity is what experience looks like...
But you need to have some kind of qualia to have any idea of brain activity. Brain activity is an interpretation of some qualia. So you can't say there are correlations between interpretation of qualia and some other qualia. It's all qualia. You're just interpreting this and interpreting that and then comparing the interpretations. That's going on in your mind. That's just you juggling around your interpretations somehow, and abstractions, or whatever you want to call it. That doesn't say anything about the outside. You're just juggling on the inside, right? And it doesn't matter how hard you juggle these things around, you're never going to pop outside the windscreen, right?
From across
It's like
a dissociative
the pilots, doing all sorts of 1,000 different, needles and gadgets and throwing around and, calling it this, calling it that, and at some point believing that they're outside the windscreen. That's ridiculous, right?
boundary, then that image does not need to be complete. It does not need to have everything there is to say about the phenomenon it is an image of. For instance,
okay, he keeps saying that the he is experiencing a phenomenon, or he is experiencing qualia that is a representation of a phenomenon outside his qualia. I can't hear it any other way, right? I don't care what he calls that which he believes to be outside, calling it phenomena, calling it subjectivity, I don't care what he calls it. It's the bare appeal to something, any kind of description of anything beyond his windscreen that I'm saying he's bullshitting you, right? He's just using some fancy words that you might not be used to somebody using and thinking, oh, he has 2 PhDs, so it's just me who's stupid. And then at some point you'll say, okay, I guess he's right because he's this smart crusader on idealism, right? But the foundational logic or the foundational philosophical structure is invalid. He's just throwing around words and hoping some magic pops out of it, right?
And this is trivial. If you look at a person, you see a body. A body is the image of the person. But it doesn't tell you everything there is to say about the person. It doesn't tell you what's going on underneath the skin. It doesn't tell you what's going on the back of the person if you're looking at the person head on. There are a great many things that are not told about the person by the person's image. In other words, the person's body. And that's why sometimes, like psychedelic experience, like in the choking game, or G-force-induced loss of consciousness, or trance, and so on.
I don't want to be a part of any choking game here, or pushing any ideas of choking games, right? I disclaim this. This is not something I blue stamp in any way. In fact, I'm rejecting it. Please don't listen to him about these matters, right? Please.
And so forth. Brain activity does not correlate with experience. I would go further, and I would say that brain activity, our body in general, because it is the image of the altar when represented on a dashboard, it is also a representation of the dissociative process itself, not only the contents within the dissociation. When you have an altar, that altar has certain memories, certain experiences, which you could describe as the content.
How do you know? Or how do you get to it if it's not knowledge? It's just claims, right? You have to be strict about how he argues for this. He's just coming up with it. He's just stating it as if it's sort of, because I made this leap beta based on an if, and I claimed it to be a fact, now I can go and fabulate about whatever I want about this outside thing here, right? And still it's sort of kind of blurred what he actually means when he's saying, are we actually outside? Or is he talking about a representation on the inside, or what? It's sort of this gray area. It's sort of a sort of shell game where you're not really sure where we are in this description, right? I don't buy that. It has to be fucking clear. You have to make sure that people are not, thinking something other than what you're actually describing. And if you're not being clear on that, I must consider that you're actually out to confuse people so that they might fall for some kind of sophist trap of some kind, right? And you might think that you're sort of brilliant in this philosophy here, and thinking that, this is perfect, right? You might not be aware that it's maybe be some more, or, to some extent sophist in nature. because you think you're this great orator of philosophy, right?
Of the alter. But what defines the alter as an alter is its dissociative boundary, which is also a process. And as a process, it should also look like something. There should be something that dissociation itself looks like, not only the contents of the dissociation. And that should be part of what we call brain activity. Some brain activity must be what the
I have lost track of this, right? He's sort of connecting 6 or 7 dots in one go, and that there should be this and there should be that, and there must be a presentation of this and presentation of that, and no. He is fabulating way beyond what he's able to do, right? It's sort of this, yeah. Your qualia are just sort of funny pictures. They're not the real thing, right? Sort of this Platonic idea of, I'm talking about the forms, not the horse, but the form horse that is much more important than the horse, right? It's sort of this old mind over matter thing, right? My mental ideas and my concepts and my abstraction and theories are much more important than that stupid elephant or that stupid no good tomato. This is just something you go and fetch in the store and then go back and eat. That's just some, basic, peasantry, concern, right? But I have these big mental ideas, right? Ooh, I'm an academic, right? Oh.
Dissociative process itself looks like. And if psychedelics and the choking game and G-force-induced loss of consciousness and so on and so forth, if by impairing brain activity, they are in fact impairing the dissociation itself, the dissociative boundary, rendering the dissociative boundary more porous, more permeable, then you...
Oh, the permeable. So this is how we get through the windscreen, right? By, finding somebody who has shot themselves through the head and destroyed their brain some way or another, and that has that built-in inhibition you have that makes you unable to penetrate the windscreen. But if you do some choking things, and I'm not encouraging anybody here, I'm trying to refute it, right? That you can somehow penetrate this wall and go and look at stuff, right? This is crazy talk. Completely crazy talk, right? And it's like if you say, and as I pointed out in a comment on the recent video, that he claims that saying everything is mind is the most parsimonious explanation. No, it isn't. There's one that's even simpler, right? And that is, you only have access to your experiences, right? Even if you say, yes, there might be a representation of an outside, you still can go and say anything about that outside. You still have to work with your experiences in order, and these being then representations. Then you're working with the representations. But it becomes overbloated, this philosophy, by like a factor of 20 or 30 or 40, because he feels he needs to go out there and explain that world he doesn't have access to. So it becomes so convoluted and complex, and throwing around terms and using invalid leaps like appealing to science and whatever shit, right? And basing a fact on an if and so on. Don't give me any crap about that being parsimonious. The parsimonious is to say, I have my experiences, and I'm classifying and clarifying in my philosophy how I approach that experience. And I'm leaving that world out there completely alone because, as you state yourself, you have an impenetrable windscreen. And on that windscreen, there are these colors and sounds and so on, and that's what you have to work with, right? Otherwise, you will spend the rest of your days trying to grapple with this shit out there that you don't have access to, and that's why it becomes so convoluted, because you do not have access to it, right? Nobody is spending 10 hours to explain to you what a color is. For a very simple reason. Everybody has a direct access to it, apparently, right? And that's also axiomatic, because I have access to my own colors. But I am willing to very reasonably make the axiom that everybody else I consider an individual like me can have color experiences. And it seems to me that everybody does that implicitly, work from that axiom, because no philosophers are trying to explain colors, right? But they are spending a lot of time trying to convince me about some kind of access to that mind out there, right? Or that world, realm, or whatever, beyond my experiences. The more convoluted and complex and weird it gets, it's more likely that it's something you can't say anything about, right?
I would expect there to be more experiences, because less dissociation means, by definition, more experiences. When that woman in Germany was blinded because of dissociation, upon that blind outer fading and the host personality reassuming control, the woman could see more experiences, which correlate with a reduction of dissociation. So I would submit to you that most of the times, experience correlates with brain activity because one is what the other looks like. Not because one is the cause of, not because brain activity is the cause of experience, but because brain activity is what experience looks like. So more experience, more brain activity. Most of the times. But some impairments of brain activity are impairments of the dissociation itself. They render the dissociative boundary more porous. And then,
mind you, he is just fabulating about something he has no access to, right? He doesn't have access to this because of the windscreen, right? To stay with his analogy. He's fabulating about things he doesn't have access to, right? And the only claim to fame he has in this regard is whether or not you want to believe it or not. Because it's not philosophical. It's not correct philosophy, this, right? He's just throwing words at you and hope it sticks, right? And the worst part is he might be convinced that he's actually doing good philosophy here. I'm rejecting this outright because it's completely mental, in my opinion, right? He started out by saying, the fact is that if, right? Which is a red flag of the worst kind, right? And we're dealing with the foundations of philosophy here, right? With the deepest metaphysics, to the best of my understanding. And then he's basing a fact on an if, right? I mean, can it be more explicit without saying it directly? I'm full of shit, right?
and you will get less brain activity, less dissociation, and more experience. And I submit to you that's what happens in the psychedelic experience, under G-force-induced loss of consciousness, under...
I submit to you, right? Yeah, it's like I submit to you. Well, I'm making the statement, and I guess you have to just go with it because I have PhD squared, right? It's not humble and say, well, this my philosophy is this, right? My philosophy is. No, I submit to you, right? I submit this to my windscreen. So windscreen, beyond windscreen, accept this. Okay, we're closing in on the 1 hour mark. Please share, like, and subscribe, and give me a comment. And yes, I do want questions. I'm willing to answer questions. That was just the CJ guy who just pounded questions at me. It's like, okay, if you can't, okay, you could answer that question. Now try this question. Okay, what about this question then, right? It started to feel like you're trying to poke a hole somewhere and say, okay, you couldn't answer that one, right? Then I'm right, or you're wrong about your criticism. It started to feel a bit like that, right? I might be wrong, it's just my interpretation. And as Bernardo Kastrup says, I guess you have to go with your interpretations, right? Have a nice day. See you in the next one.